Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest who just published a book, which I finished yesterday, a fascinating true crime book. The title of the book is Cold Blooded, a true crime story of a murderous teenage vampire cult, published May 25th. His name is Frank Stanfield, and he's also published two other books. One is Vampires, Gators, and Wackos, A Newspaperman's Life, published 2014, and Unbroken, published 2011. But this is the story of the what's known as the Vampire Clan, colloquially. But I also did some research into this for my book, Abomination, so I'm somewhat familiar with that. But Frank has first-person insight into this case, so he's going to tell us about that and his book. So, Frank, are you there?
I am here. Thank you
Awesome.
for having me.
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to the interview. Fascinating book. For people who may not have heard your name, can you talk a little bit about your background and what led you to write Cold Blooded?
Sure. I've been a newspaper editor and reporter for 40 years. I was working for the Orlando Sentinel back in 1996 when this first happened, and I've been covering the thing for over 20 years ever since. So I'm still doing some newspaper work, I'm hooked. I got ink in my blood, I guess. So
Gotcha. And so this happened, Orlando. This was where the murders kind of came to press. Can you talk about the crime and what happened in this city north of Orlando?
yes, Eustis is about a small town. It's about 45 miles north of Orlando. Which of course is famous for Disney World and all that good stuff. Um, what happened was on November the 25th, 1996, a girl, a 17-year-old cheerleader at the local high school, a popular and pretty girl, she comes home and finds that her parents have been bludgeoned to death. Um, and it's just a complete nightmare. I mean, the scene is just horrific. There's blood everywhere. So she gets on the phone and calls 911 and says, "Please, my parents have been killed." And the dispatcher says, "Well, how do you know they've been killed?" She says, "Because there's blood everywhere." So when the detectives get there and start to talk with her, they say, "Who could have done this?" Oh, and the other thing was she said it to the 911 operator was, "And my sister's not here. She's only 15 years old. She's not here." So when the detective starts talking to Jennifer Windor, um, they ask who could have done it, and she says, "Well, my sister Heather." And by the way, she had a friend named Rod Farrell. So that's how the thing got started. This was probably about 10 o'clock at night, something like that. This is a quiet area, kind of a rural suburban area, and just nothing like this had happened in this area before.
And there were some kind of indicators of something even more strange happening at the crime scene. Wasn't there like 666 and there was a V on the body? Is that correct?
Yes, somebody had taken a wet finger and written 666 on the garage door. So nobody knows to this day exactly who did that. But the medical examiner gets in there and she looks at the bodies, of course, and she notices there's a V mark on the dad's arm. And it looked like somebody had put like burn marks with a cigarette or something on his arm, and then there were like uh, some dots in there. So the police, of course, are trying to figure all this out. They call up in Murray, Kentucky, because that's where Rod Farrell had moved to from Eustis. And the sheriff up there says, "You've got a really wild bunch on the loose there." He says there are members of this vampire clan or cult, and so somebody up there, one of the vampire fanciers up in Kentucky, says, "Oh, that V is a sign of Rod Farrell's cult. That's his sign."
Yeah, it wasn't his kind of cult name. It was Visaggio, right? It was a demon from the Goetia. Is that right? Something
Yeah,
like that.
he was telling all these kids that he was a vampire, 500 years old, and his name was Visago.
And so they found this guy, Rod Farrell. How did the police investigation proceed from the night of the murders?
Well, of course, they talked to everybody they could locally. They found out that Rod had come down. This murder happened on a Monday night. That Rod had come down on a Sunday and visited a friend of theirs, of his, I should say, from when he went to high school in Eustis. And she says, well, they came in with this bunch and they were talking about killing Heather's parents, but I didn't know why. I didn't believe him. He said they wanted to steal their car. I just didn't believe him. Well, so then they got to talking with Heather's boyfriend, and they found out more about Rod, um, because this boyfriend didn't want to run away with these other kids, and he's talking about Heather doing self mutilation and drinking her blood and that kind of thing. Heather drinking her own blood, that kind of thing. And then they call, like I say, the sheriff up in Murray, Kentucky, and they find out that, among other things, that he was a suspect in this horrific animal abuse case. He had, a cult had broken into this place and mutilated a whole bunch of dogs and killed them, and just awful. So they're putting all this together and figuring out who Rod Farrell is.
And so they found out some very interesting things about Rod Farrell. Can you talk about his background and his relationship with his mom?
Yes. Um, his mother had been arrested for trying to solicit sex with a 14-year-old boy, one of Rod's friends. Um, they called it crossover. She wanted to cross him over to be a vampire, this boy, while having sex with him. So this mother was arrested, and Rod was a dropout from school. He was just a bad character. He was in this cult, and it turns out the mom says, "Well, Rod threatened me that he had built an altar in his bedroom, painted his whole bedroom black, had all this occult jazz in his room, skulls and whatnot." And then they find out one of his best friends was a vampire fancier, and they hung out all night in cemeteries and played all these vampire role playing games, Vampire the Masquerade. So they're building a very strong case and talking to all these people right away.
Right. So, and Farrell, didn't they say, I think you wrote in your book, they had his own house had a pentagram on the floor somewhere. So the
Right.
mother had to kind of know what was going on with her 15,
Yeah.
16-year-old son. He was very young at the time.
Right. In fact, that pentagram was in her bedroom. When she moved out of her apartment, they found this pentagram on the wall, on the floor. And the manager says, "Well, both the mom and the son, we thought, a lot of people thought they were boyfriend and girlfriend because they both dressed in black, had black fingernails and all that kind of stuff, and were holding hands walking around the parking lot." So it was very odd.
Gotcha. And can you get closer to the microphone? It seems like somebody's hearing you a little lower.
Okay.
But he also, like, he was into demonology. It was interesting that he knew about mind control. He was only 16 when the crime happened, so very young, but also just a very strange kind of person. And the Necronomicon was involved in the whole case. There's just all the elements of this occultism there, right?
That's right. He spent a lot of his time with some friends, and they made up all these role playing games. Well, besides that, they they were like characters, and his favorite character was a vampire that could kill or do anything he wanted to do. They practiced with wooden weapons and all kinds of stuff like that. Well, Rod spent a lot of his time, this friend said, studying psychology and also black magic, trying to figure out how to do mind control. He said, if you make people fear you, you can control them. It's all about control. It's all about mind control. And of course, he also summoned up he would try to call up these demons, these various demons. So he's very into demonology, and this Necronomicon book, he had that. And they were trying to cast spells. So he was interested in witchcraft at one point, in demonology, and then he became good friends with this other guy, and he was interested in the vampires. So
Right. Was that Jaden Murphy? Jaden Murphy?
Jaden Stephen Murphy.
Right.
So that's where he got involved in that.
And there's actually like a video of Murphy online. Like, I don't know what documentary it was, but they're talking about drinking blood. They're together at some fire at night. So these guys, it was a much larger group than just Farrell's group. It was this whole subculture of vampirism and blood drinking. And they used to like cut their arms. Even both of the Wendorf kids, who were the children of the Wendorfs, were, I think, involved in bloodletting. Is that correct?
Well, Heather was. But in Kentucky, there was a large group, maybe as many as 30, the police seem to think, in this vampire clan. But then, they got to fighting amongst each other and splitting off and that kind of thing. So by the time Rod came down to Florida, he came with 3 other people. And then they picked up Heather. And then this is where it gets interesting, because the question is, did Heather know her parents are going to be killed? Did she plan it? Was she in on the planning? Was she a victim? What was going on with Heather? That's always a question in everybody's mind.
Yeah, and that will kind of pervade your entire book, is how involved was she? People seem to be covering for her. She denied it, but it seemed like they knew that Farrell had a real mean streak too. Like, he was talking about killing people for months before the murders, right?
Yeah, he was obsessed. For example, Heather told her sister Jennifer had an abusive boyfriend at the time. And so Heather says, well, do you want him dead? Because I know this guy that could do it, meaning Farrell. And then one time, she asked Jennifer one night, she says, Jen, have you ever thought about plotting Mom and Dad's death? And Jennifer says, I just blew that off. No, end of discussion right there. But yeah, Heather was writing all kinds of really dark entries in her journal, and talking about being a hideous monster, feel like she's being torn in two, and how she likes to drink blood, and all this stuff. And then Farrell was sending all this material, all these writings and drawings and so on. Both Heather and Rod were artistic types. They could draw very well. So they found a lot of this stuff in her room. So, and Rod's girlfriend, his girlfriend when he was in Florida, I should say, was Heather's best friend, Janine. So Heather was keeping all this material in her room because Janine's parents didn't like Rod.
Gotcha. And didn't Rod say he had some kind of cult background? Like, there was a grandfather, and there was supposedly this Black Mask group, but that was never verified. Can you talk about that?
Yes. When the group was arrested, they were arrested in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, 3 days after the murder. So Rod tells the cops, he says, look, I'll tell you everything. I just want to talk to my girlfriend, the girlfriend that he brought down from Kentucky with him. Her name was Charity Kesey. And he says, I just want to talk to her. So then he starts talking about how he's disturbed, and that he says, I was raped at 5 years old by my grandfather's friends. They were in this a group called the Black Mask, and they made a human sacrifice. And so it's part of the ritual, they raped me and all this sort of jazz. So that's where that comes from. But it's interesting, during the trial, when they had the trial, the grandfather's wife says, no, he wasn't part of any cult or whatever. And I asked the grandfather myself at the trial. He didn't testify, but I asked him out in the hall. I says, well, did you rape did you and your friends rape Rod? Were you in his cult? And he said no. So
And did the trial? They got extradited back to Florida, right? So where did that trial? It was close to Orlando. Is that correct? Where you were located?
yes, it was in Tavares, which is the county seat in Lake County.
So you were there, like, and you saw when the news broke and everything like that, how the story kind of developed through the media. Can you talk about that? Your involvement?
Yes, this was one of those rare cases where, well, the Sentinel, all newspapers really are kind of a shadow of their former selves, unfortunately, these days. But the Sentinel had a big bureau in Tavares, the county seat in Lake County, and so they immediately sent reporters to uh, Baton Rouge for the extradition. They sent them to Kentucky to find out what was going on. They sent them everywhere. Um, and I was the court reporter for that bureau. So I was very fortunate because we decided we were going to cover every piece of paper, every hearing, everything. We were going to talk to everybody that was a witness. I mean, we just covered that thing like a blanket. So it was very interesting.
And you have all the names of the prosecutor, the judge. So you saw that firsthand. What was your impression of Farrell and that group when you first kind of saw them? I mean, weren't they kind of strange in a way?
Oh yeah. Well, when they brought him back from Baton Rouge, um, they brought him back, and one of the girls, she was like 20 years old, I believe she was. So she was an adult. They brought her back earlier, but Farrell and his girlfriend Charity, and Heather, and Scott Anderson, who was actually went into the house with Rod. They brought them back. They brought him to the jail. They brought him inside the jail, and Farrell is like sticking his tongue out at the photographers. And then he goes inside the jail, and there's a like a glass partition there in the booking area, and he smooches that thing. He's just showing off and acting like a complete jerk. Um, that was interesting. So that was my first time that I actually saw him. So I'm thinking, okay, this is what we're going to be dealing with. It's going to
Right,
be like a three-ring circus.
right. And so then, I mean, you saw him and these other girls. Uh, how did he progress? Didn't he try to feign kind of insanity for his own benefit?
Oh yeah. So what happened was I sent a letter to the jail to him asking for an interview. I said, and I've done this many times before with other people. I said, okay, so we're getting all the information we're getting is from one source, from one side is from the police and the prosecutors. But there's always two sides to every story. We'd like to hear your story. So I dropped a note off with my phone number on there and everything. And I waited and waited and waited. And then I went home. And then he called. And so two other reporters have been running over there and talked with him. And the headline in the Sentinel the next day was "Interview with a Vampire," which is the takeoff on the Anne Rice movie book. So basically, he says, "Yeah." He says, "I've got multiple personalities, like Sybil, and I have these special blackout moments, and I don't know. Sometimes I'm mellow, sometimes I'm not." And then he claims that Anderson, his buddy Anderson, went into the house, and he was like taking a nap by a tree, and Anderson had borrowed his boots, and all kinds of silly stuff like that. And it was like complete nonsense. And the sheriff and the prosecutor said, "Well, that's the first we've heard of any kind of multiple personality thing." And I interviewed some people and some psychiatrists in Miami, and they said, "That's so rare. That dissociative disorder is so rare. We don't even know if it's for real or not, if anybody has it."
Right.
So,
So it didn't quite help him. I mean, he was charged, but there were also other people in that group were charged, right? Goodman and who else got charged in the murders?
okay, it was Scott Anderson. Both of those guys were charged with first degree murder. Then the two girls were charged with principal to murder and an armed burglary, some other charges like that. Heather was charged by the cops But in Florida, if you're going to be charged with first degree murder, you have to be indicted by a grand jury. So they have a grand jury and they indict everybody but Heather. Now she's still under arrest in a juvenile detention center. They move everybody else to adult jail. And so the sheriff is really getting ticked off, Sheriff George Knupp at that time. And so then they have another grand jury to deal with her, and she testifies. You can invoke the Fifth Amendment, right to remain silent, but she waived that and testified before the grand jury and said, I didn't know my parents were going to be harmed. So the grand jury cut her loose.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. And so the sheriff was incensed, and a lot of people, the grand jury said what she did was wrong. Running away was wrong. Hanging out with these people was wrong, but it's not a crime. She didn't commit a crime because she said she didn't know her parents were going to be killed.
And there is some truth to that. Like Farrell didn't know that he was going to, I mean, according to him, it wasn't planned that he was going to do it either, right? At least that's what he said. But
Right.
That's the way it turned out, right? Him and Goodman were in the house, right?
Right. It was him and Scott Anderson.
Anderson, sorry, wrong name. Yeah, Anderson.
Yeah, they were in the house, but Farrell is the one that did the blows. The other kid just kind of froze up. But what happened was they went in there. This is one reason it's called cold blooded. They went in there, and they went in there with a couple of sticks, basically. But Rod found a crowbar or a tire iron, one or the other, in a garage. He picked that up. And so they go in, and the dad is asleep in the family room. TV's on, or it's dark rather. And they sort of dance around him while he's asleep. And Rod lowers the tire iron like he's going to hit him, and then he doesn't, and this goes on about 3 times. And finally he says, something told me I shouldn't do this, or it might be bad consequences. And then I said, oh, what the heck, basically, and just hit him about 20 times till he wasn't even recognizable. The mom, Ruth Queen, her name, that was Richard Wendorf, the victim there. The mom, Ruth Queen, comes out of the bedroom. She'd been in the shower. She's got hot coffee in her hand. And she says, what do you want? And then she realized, that this is a bad thing. So she threw the coffee in his face, and that outraged him. So he beat her to death and took the blunt end, or the sharper end of it, and dug it into her skull. It was just horrific, just a horrific crime scene. It was awful.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said overkill in your book, like it was too much or something. Yeah, it was like horrific injuries. And so, how did the intro to the trial go? I mean, he's 16 at the time, and he got tried as an adult. Is that correct?
That's right. Which is a kind of a common thing in Florida, has been for a while, for a serious crime like this. So, in Florida, if you want to have a death penalty case, you have 2 phases. First phase is called the guilt phase, where you decide whether or not the guy did it or not. And then if he's guilty on that, then the jury has to hear testimony, mitigating evidence, psychologists, or whatever they want to put out there, why he shouldn't be killed. And the prosecutor has to argue that he should be killed under certain statutory requirements. So to avoid the death penalty, Farrell gets up on the first day of the trial, right after it starts, even before the opening argument is finished for the prosecutor. He gets up basically and says, I want to plead guilty, in hopes that the prosecutor would not seek the death penalty. But the state attorney, Brad King, who was a proponent of the death penalty, says, no, I have an obligation to present a case, and we're going to continue on. So it goes from there.
And how did that case progress? I mean, you go in detail on all that court. Were you in court for most of those proceedings?
I was in court for all of it. Yes, what happened was in the death penalty phase. Well, during when he was first arrested, when Rod was first arrested, and all those kids, the prosecutor and the defense attorney, who is the public defender, assistant public defender, they put out a press release saying, "Look, this thing has nothing to do with vampirism. It's just call it the Windorf case or whatever, but it's nothing to do with vampirism." Well, when they get into the trial, now all of a sudden, as far as the defense is concerned, it's all about vampirism. The object is to show that he couldn't help himself because he was under the influence of the occult. He had a terrible childhood, all this stuff. Because the defense knew they were in big trouble because Rod made all that confession to the cops, not only to the Baton Rouge police, but also to the Lake County detectives who drove up there to interview him and the other kids. So they had all this confession, and it was on videotape. And the judge ruled that a lot of it was going to be admissible. So they knew they were in big trouble. And but the defense, that was their strategy, and they had all these psychologists to talk about how he was under emotional duress and all this sort of thing, and he couldn't help himself, basically.
Right. Like he was destined to do it. Then they diagnosed him with schizotypal personality disorder or something like that.
That's right. Yeah. So it gets to be a very, but it's interesting because the state, they had three psychologists, psychiatrists, one psychiatrist, two psychologists testify. And one of those psychologists he says, I've interviewed 700 murder defendants, and this is the most dysfunctional family I've ever seen. So that was interesting, but the state didn't put on any psychologist. He just basically kept poking holes in the testimony of these psychologists. They go on this thing called the DSM, the Diagnostic Psychological Manual. It's like the psychologist's Bible, basically.
Right.
And so they would say, "Oh, well, schizotypal," and then he says, "Well, couldn't he also have been, diagnosed as conduct disorder, which is like setting fires, lying, and animal abuse and all that kind of stuff?" Basically, just sort of throwing shade on their theory, So, and then of course there was DNA. That was very interesting too. There was DNA. What happened was Ruth Queen fought him very hard. She dug her fingernails into his face. So as he was killing her. So there was DNA of him underneath her fingernails. So basically I said how bitter an irony that was that she pointed out her killer from the grave with his blood. It was like his blood under her fingernails, and his blood, or rather her blood on his boots. So that was, it was obvious. It was just so obvious.
Right. He didn't really have a chance. He was going to go down. I mean, they had the boot prints, right, from the boots he was wearing when he was arrested in Baton Rouge.
Yeah.
What was their rationale to go to Baton Rouge anyway? Wasn't there some draw there?
Well, what they were going to do, the plan was, if you want to call it an actual plan, it wasn't much of a plan. They were going to go to New Orleans. Supposedly, Rod was he was fascinated with the place, and nobody's ever said this, but I can't help but wonder if he wanted to go see where Anne Rice lived. But the plan was they were going to go to Mardi Gras, even though Mardi Gras wasn't like for several months. But he told these kids that he knew this voodoo character up there at New Orleans named the Chicken Man, and they were going to hang out there and delve more into the occult. Well, they get up there and Charity is freaking out because Um, it's they go into a bad neighborhood. And she sees people with guns, and she's just freaking out. She says, "Let's get out of here." So they leave there after only a few hours and start driving. They end up in the woods somewhere between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and they rob a house, burglarize a house, I should say. And then they end up in Baton Rouge. It's Thanksgiving Day. Everything's closed. They don't have any money. They were going to pawn some of the stuff they stole. They, you know, they're broke. They're dirty and hungry. And so Charity calls her grandmother to get a hold of her mother. And the mom says, "Okay, look, go to the nearest Howard Johnson and stay there, and I'll wire the money and so on." And it was a trap. They get arrested.
Right, that's what led to their arrest. But they tried to get as much money out of the Wendorf house too, right? So they weren't very successful in
No,
obtaining money. Yeah, it was just a real haphazard plot or plan.
yeah, they got a credit card, which they used somewhat. They went up to Tallahassee. Um, they basically followed the interstates. They went up to Tallahassee on I-75. They used a credit card up there. Went to a Walmart, got a few things, including a knife. But then I think he realized, they could trace this credit card, so they got rid of the credit card. So it was just a haphazard adventure at most.
And Scott Anderson, do you think that he was really under Farrell's sway? Was he kind of like mind controlled, or was he subject to Farrell's personality?
He was a follower. Um, his defense attorney described him as a follower, and I think that's a fair statement. His background, his family background was just awful. It was like something out of Tobacco Road or Grapes of Wrath or something. It was just awful. I mean, um, his dad was addicted to all kinds of drugs, had all kind of mental illnesses. The family had he and his brothers were put into foster care because uh, the dad was abusing the mom, and the mom refused to, go along with the social services people, and it was just awful. Just and poverty, oh brother, it's just awful. So he said, I was just looking for an identity, basically. So here's this kid, Charity, um, being raised by her single parent dad. This other girl, Dana Cooper, the adult, she was basically working in a dead end kind of job.
Outcome for Scott Anderson.
But yes, he was facing the death penalty too. So he pleaded guilty to first degree murder and got sentenced to life. So what happened later is the Supreme Court keeps moving the goalpost. The Florida Supreme Court decided about a year after Rod is sentenced to death row that we shouldn't be sentencing 16-year-olds or persons that commit a crime like this when they're 16 to death row. So they commuted Rod's sentence to life. So years later, the U.S. Supreme Court has this case called Miller versus Alabama and some other cases where they said, juveniles' brains are still developing. Your brain is still developing until you're 25 years old, the doctors say. So we don't think you should automatically sentence juveniles to life in prison. So therefore, you have to give them a hearing, a special hearing, a resentencing hearing. So Scott got his resentencing hearing and got his life sentence reduced to 40 years a couple of years ago. And I had interviewed him in the jail over there. And so, and it's an interesting thing, when the initial trial was going on, his mother took their Social Security, the family Social Security money check, and flew to Orlando with one of her kids without any money in her pocket, and called the Sentinel and says, "Okay, we're here," to the reporter that talked with him in Kentucky, Jerry Falstrom. And And Jerry says, well, what do you mean? What do you mean you're here? I mean, he had no clue she was going to come. It was like one of those things like, well, if you're in Florida, look me up kind of thing, you know? So she shows up, and it's my job now to go pick her up and this boy and try to find them a place to stay. Um, so that's how I got to know his mother. So when Scott is back in Lake County several years later, I reminded Scott, I says, well, I'm the one that picked up your mother from the airport. So it sort of gave me an in. And,
Right.
you know, Scott was a pitiful person, basically. You know, he was 17 and he just decided to throw in with the wrong guy. You know, basically, it was. I mean, he should be punished. He is being punished, but he did not. He was not the motivator, the driving force behind this awful crime.
And so he's still in jail? Is he
He
due
is.
to be? Is he due to be released, or how long? He's been in there for what, 30 years now, right?
Yeah, he's going to get out. I think in 2050. I think it is.
Oh wow.
So yeah,
So he's in there for the duration. Yeah,
yeah, his
that's
life.
a tragedy.
Yeah.
So his life, and he kind of blames Farrell for the wreckage of his life, right?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. He says if I had just not gotten into the car, it was his little car that they came down to Florida in. He says if I'd have just driven away and said no, we're not doing this, then my life would be different.
Wow, yeah. And you were in a Oxygen Channel documentary called Deadly Cults with Farrell, right, in 2019? Can you talk about that?
Yes. Um, that was very interesting too because um, again they talked with Jaden, and that was a real insight to Jaden too. Jaden, this whole vampire thing is supposed to be a big secret, you see, but Rod messed it all up. There's vampire rules, as it turns out. You're not supposed to tell anybody you're a vampire, and there are certain rules like you're not supposed to take blood from somebody um, that involuntarily, and you're not supposed to kill people, and you're supposed to keep everything on the down low, and all this sort of thing. So this publicity from this case just blew this all out. But it's interesting because Jaden in this documentary was very vocal about his interest in vampirism. Unlike it 20 years ago, he was like, "Oh, I was just doing role playing and stuff like that." He really downplayed it then, but he came out in this documentary and talked about how it's like it stirred his soul. The nighttime called me, and all that kind of stuff. And I interviewed him during the trial too, and he said, vampires. I'm not. I know I'm a vampire, but it's a lifestyle. And he says Farrell told me that if he did kill anybody, ever did kill anybody, it'd be by bludgeoning them, which of course he did.
Wow, fascinating. Yeah, really disturbing. I mean, do you know if Murphy is still involved in that whole subculture of the vampire sub? He is. So he is. And these guys are like got to be in their 50s, right? 40s or 50s?
40s, I think.
40s, gotcha.
Yeah, because they were classmates. Jaden was a classmate of Rod's up in Kentucky.
Gotcha. Well, Frank, we are at 40 minutes. Really a fascinating book, fascinating interview from first-person accounts of this whole case. Is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed before we wrap the interview up?
Well, yes. Rod had a rehearing. So he had this rehearing in 2019. And this went on for like 3 days. And there was a new set of psychologists who said, look, he had abused drugs. He had been misled by Heather. Heather said that he was Heather said she'd been abused by her father and all this stuff. And the family, Jennifer told the judges, don't let this guy out. Don't let him out ever. And the other side of the family, Ruth Queen's family, were also very upset. They were there, and Richard Wendorf's brother, one of his brothers, testified, said, "Don't let him out." It was just my brother was just killed for the thrill of it, that kind of thing. So the judge listened to all this testimony, and the state did present a psychologist this time, who said no, he wasn't suffering from schizotypal disorder. He had some personality disorders, but it wasn't that. So basically, after several weeks, the judge issued a ruling and says, no, Farrell is incorruptibly corrupt. He's got a history of lying. He lies about everything. He shows no remorse, basically, even though Farrell got on the stand and apologized to the family.
Interesting.
I'm sorry. I did, I didn't know what, I don't want to say he didn't know what he was doing, but he says, I didn't know what my actions would have this kind of consequences and all this. He seemed emotional. He seemed genuine, but he lies so much, how do you believe anything he says? So the judge says, no, he stays in prison forever.
So he's in there forever. Wow. Yeah, great book. I'm sorry, continue, please.
I was going to say, although that's under appeal now, so who knows?
Right, so that's the system. Where's the best place for people to find this book and your other books?
Amazon is probably the best place, and also Wild Blue Press. You can order my book on Wild Blue Press also. Awesome. And I have a web page. It's frankestanfield.com.
frankestanfield.com. It's Stanfield. And
right.
Are you planning to do an audio version of the book?
Yes, they're doing an audio version right now.
Awesome. So that's it. Right now, like half of the book sales are now an audio version. So that's really important to get that out so people can listen to it as well. And again, the title of the book is Cold Blooded, a true crime story of a murderous teenage vampire cult by Frank Stanfield, published May 25th, 2021. Thanks so much, Frank. Appreciate it. Great interview.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good night.
Bye.
Are you still there?